So the purpose of the law was never intended by God to save us. That's why our author here is talking about a better covenant with better promises. And let's describe those better promises here. He says, for finding fault with them, he saith, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Here our author is quoting from Jeremiah 31, verse 31 and forward. Jeremiah predicted, prophesied the new covenant during his lifetime, which, by the way, he lived in a very terrible state that Israel was in, and he prophesied against them constantly. He was known as the weeping prophet because nobody listened to him. And every time he opened his mouth, they threw him in jail. And it doesn't. But he's the one that prophesied this new commandment, or this new covenant, rather. Now let's see the promises, the better promises. He says, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they continued not in my covenant, and I regarded them not, saith the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, saith the Lord, I will put my laws into their mind and write them in their hearts. And I will be to them a God, and they shall be to me a people. And they shall not teach every man his neighbor, and every man his brother, saying, know the Lord, for all shall know me, from the least to the greatest. For I will be merciful to their unrighteousness, and their sins and their iniquities will I remember no more. Those are some amazing promises, aren't they? Those are the promises in the covenant, of the new covenant of grace, as opposed to the old covenant of law. Now let's notice a distinction here, because that's what our author is getting us to see. Let's look at the difference. Under the new covenant of grace, it's unconditional in nature. What does that mean? That means it's not up to you. It's not up to your performance. It's not up to your ability. It's not up to your works. It's unconditional. It's up to God. God said he'd do it, and he's doing it. The old covenant was purely conditional, wasn't it? If you behave yourself, God will bless you. If you don't behave yourself, God will curse you. It's conditioned upon your performance and your works. That's the old covenant. The new covenant is an unconditional covenant of grace. God's amazing ability to work in you personally and directly. Now, to help us with that contrast, before we get into these promises, which we'll probably hold off till next week to really explore, to help us with that contrast, I'm going to turn back to another chapter of Paul's letter to the Corinthians, in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. I want to read a few verses with you, just so you get the idea of the contrast here. Paul calls the Corinthians, by the way, the people he was writing this church to, he gives them a special name. He says, you are our epistle, or our letter, written in our hearts, known and read of all men. For as much as you are manifestly declared to be the epistle, or the letter of Christ. This is what Jesus wrote in your heart. The epistle of Christ, ministered by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not in tables of stone, but in the fleshly tables of the heart. You all see what he's getting to here? This contrast is between what God does inside of you as opposed to what He demands for you to do outside of you. See, the law of God was external, written in stones in the Old Covenant. But in the New Covenant, the law of God is put within your minds. It is put, written on your heart. Now, who does it? The Spirit of God Himself is the one that does it. So let me be so bold as to say this about the two. The Old Covenant says, you behave yourself, or God will curse you. You behave yourself and God will bless you. The New Covenant says, God is going to make you behave. Sound a little different? A whole big difference there, isn't it? Now, before you bow up in pride, thinking that God can't cause you to do anything, just explain to me why your heart is still beating, why you are drawing that next breath. It's because of God working in you. He can, He will, and He does do exactly what He says He would. What's He doing? The Spirit of God is writing His law in your hearts right now. He's already at work doing that.